everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in to study some Jewish history together. As we completed last week's session, we were talking about the crumbling of the Roman Empire, the dividing of the Roman Empire, and the prelude to the Dark Ages. Now, at this point, we're going to see the Roman Empire essentially transition from being a two-part empire, the Western Roman Empire, centered in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known as the Byzantine Empire, centered in a city that was originally called Byzantium, and then after Constantine, the name of the city was changed to Constantinople. At this point, those two parts of the empire have completely 100% and finally split into two empires. And as the Roman Empire really crumbles and falls apart, they're going to essentially transition from being empires into churches, which will be one and the same. Because from this point, really up until modern times, the church is going to be basically an empire. So we're going to have what was the Western Roman Empire based in Rome. That'll become what we know as the Roman Catholic Church. And the Eastern Roman Empire based in Constantinople, that will be known as the Eastern Orthodox or the Greek Orthodox Church. And those will be the divisions of the Roman Empire as we proceed through time. Now, at this point, we see the beginning of the Dark Ages, and basically the end of the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, that is. The Eastern Roman Empire continues to survive, but the Western Roman Empire will basically fall into the Dark Ages. Any of the intellectia, any of the education that was once part and parcel of the Roman Empire will only be preserved in the monasteries by the monks, but for the most part, the whole Western Roman Empire, Europe as we know it, Western Europe as we know it, will go into the 6 centuries of the Dark Ages. We don't have a lot of recorded history. We don't know a lot of what happened outside of the Jewish world. We do have some Jewish history recorded of that time, but they're in the Dark Ages. People become illiterate. All the advancements of Rome are completely undone within the Western Roman Empire, and that's the Dark Ages. We know it. We call it the Dark Ages not because it was physically dark, but it was spiritually dark with no cultural developments. There was all this cultural recession, educational recession, and the world's going to have to climb its way out of that several centuries later. Now, part of how this happens is the great city of Rome, or the Roman Western Empire, is just chiseled away at from different tribes, the Gauls, the Visigoths, the Huns, and those tribes are much more primitive. And as those tribes take over different chunks of the Western Roman Empire, they bring their lack of culture and education with them, and with that falls the great Roman Empire, the western part of the empire. Now, as we start to proceed through these next few centuries, the 4th century, the 5th century, the 6th century, we see the true stronghold of Christianity, because that's all that's going to be in the West, and that's the controlling character of the empire in the East. Now, at this point, the full-on anti-Semitism of the church will come out against the Jews. We'll see it in force from this point on. Really, the creation of anti-Semitism. It'll later be imported from the church to other parts of the world, to the Muslims eventually in modern times, but it is created at this time 100% by the church. Now, what happens at this time period is that the church cannot take the fact that the Jews did not embrace Christianity. And in truth, that presents a number of Jewish problems for the Christians. Because, first of all, the part and parcel, just right at the beginning of the Jewish-Christian problem, is the fact that their Savior, Jesus, was a Jew. He started out of the Jewish people. He claimed, or their claim is that he was king of the Jews. The whole religion, Christianity, comes from the word Christ, which in Latin means Messiah, which we say in Hebrew, Mashiach. And that is the whole religion. It started out of the Jews. So the fact that the people of, the people who are chosen by God, and from their perspective, were chosen to have Jesus come out of them, and then they reject Jesus, well, that raises a tremendous theological problem for them, and it's a theological problem that's we'll see how they resolve it, but it's never really resolved. The other big issue that the Christians have is the Torah, because as they write at this time, or in the centuries preceding this, they write their New Testament, as they call it. They do embrace the Jewish Torah and Tanakh as what they call the Old Testament. I call it the good Old Testament, but they embrace it as part of the Christian Bible. So that means that if you were a Christian, and you open and study the Bible. Now, I should just point out that really until modern times, that was an anathema. You were not allowed to study the Bible. They didn't want Christians reading the Bible. They wanted them just to hear how to understand the religion from their leaders, and studying the Bible was until really the Protestant Reformation, it was looked down upon by all Christians. But being as it may, if a Christian was to look in the first part of their Bible, they would see something pretty similar to our Tanakh. And not only would they see that, but they'd see a much different character than their New Testament. Because if we look in the Torah, Torah is not a history book at its core. It is a book of Hirah, of guidance, of laws. And the whole Torah is full of the laws of how we behave as Jews and how we act as Jews. Now, for them, that raised another problem, because they were incorporating this as part of their religion. They claim that Jesus lived as an observant Jew his whole entire life. Yet they say God changed his mind. The commandments are only up until Jesus. When Jesus died for your sins, you also didn't have to follow the commandments anymore. And they start hemming and hawing all kinds of theology to basically make it that the Torah does not have to be observed anymore. Now, it's interesting to point out, I have a very dear friend by the name of Rabbi Usher Wade, who lives in Israel, who, before he converted to Judaism and eventually became a rabbi, was a minister. And part of the way that he, so to speak, made his way to Judaism was this question. This question bothered him very much, that the front half of the book, so to speak, had all these thou shalts and thou shalt nots that were completely ignored by the back of the book and by his religion. And that was a big part of what got him asking questions about Christianity, and eventually led him away from Christianity to Judaism. But that is a Jewish problem that Christians have early on about how to deal with the mitzvos. They move away from the mitzvos, they move away from the commandments, say you don't have to follow them, but they're really rewriting the whole thing at that point, making it a totally different ball of wax. Now, what's interesting is when we get to modern times, and in a couple of weeks, months, we'll see that in the 18th century we have Jewish groups that do that as well. On into the 19th century, 20th century, and still those groups are alive today. They also come along and say, oh, well, the mitzvahs don't apply, the commandments don't apply, they were written for a different time, they were written for this and that, written by a man, not really by God, whatever it is. But that was originally done by the Christians. I mean, that's what Christianity did. They took the Torah, they incorporated it, but they had to come up with some theological reason why you really didn't have to follow it. So I always find it ironic that when you have these 18th century Jewish groups and 18th and 19th century Jewish groups that will eventually develop and really in many ways go further than the Christians, because the Christians agree that at some point the Jews followed it and that was the ideal for a time, and then God changed his mind. Later, Jewish groups come along and say, oh, it's not even from God to begin with, so you don't have to follow it. Okay, so they go to a certain extent even further than the Christians went, but that's how the Christians basically deal with this problem of the Torah. Now, from our perspective, the reason why that's ludicrous is because the Torah itself, and the written Torah, and for sure in the oral tradition, make it very, very clear that everything in the Torah is eternal. It's not meant to be just until, let's say, the Mashiach comes. In other words, when the Messiah really does come, you and I will continue to observe the Torah 100%. Because the Torah says, I mean, many times. One of the famous ones talking about Shabbos. Beni uvein bnei Yisrael osi leolam. The observance of Shabbos is a sign for the Jewish people for eternity. So you can really say to the early Christian and the later Christian, and even more so to the Jewish groups that will move away from Jewish observance. Like, do you think God was lying when he said that Shabbos is a sign between the observance of Shabbos is a sign between himself and the Jewish people for eternity? And when he talks about how we should never change the Torah and how it's eternal and all these things, like, you think he was kidding? You think he changed his mind? Why would he put it in there and then change his mind? And how do you know he changed his mind when, he gave us the Torah so long ago? So that's a problem that the early Christians, and then if we would fast forward, these latter-day Jewish groups have, and this, it being pretty clear in the Torah that the law of the Torah is eternal. I mean, as a matter of fact, Maimonides, the Rambam, and his 13 Principles of Jewish Faith says it very clearly. We have a couple different ways that we remember the 13 Principles. One of the most famous ones is the Yigdal poem that many shuls sing. Some people have the custom to say it every day, where we say, Lo yachalif hakel, v'lo yamir daso, la'olamin l'zulaso. The God will not change his mind ever. It is eternal. This is his message and his guidance and his book of laws for the world. And you know what? What's interesting, and just to take this point a little bit further, is, and part of why it's kind of difficult for the Christians, is that Christianity believes, or has to believe, for the sake of their religion, that God spoke to the Jews on Mount Sinai. In other words, national revelation happened at Mount Sinai, and the Torah was given at Mount Sinai. And okay, he changed his mind later when Jesus comes along. Okay, but like when he gathered with Moshe the whole Jewish people together to tell them to observe the Torah and get the details from Moshe, why wouldn't he gather the whole Jewish people, the whole world together again to say, by the way, guys, changed my mind, now it's up to Jesus, or really up to Paul/Saul? Why didn't he gather everyone together again? Why, if he was going to change his mind from what he said originally, do it in the same process so it has the same legitimacy? So I say, you can't fake mass revelation, but again, in Christianity, they believe mass revelation happened at Sinai. In Islam, as we'll get to tonight, they believe mass revelation happened at Sinai. So it's funny, just as an aside, if we look at the world, you have 1 billion Christians who believe that God gave the Torah to the Jews on Mount Sinai. You have 1 billion Muslims who believe that God gave the Torah to the Jews on Mount Sinai. And you have a few crazy right-wing Orthodox Jews who believe that God gave the Torah on Mount Sinai. Anyhow, but that's the theological problem that the Christians had to deal with, and they dealt with it by saying basically God changed his mind just up until Jesus. After Jesus, that all changes. Now, one of the ways that the Christians theologically deal with this problem of the Jews being around, the Jews still observing the Torah, the Jews not accepting Jesus, the Jews still observing the Torah when they're saying you don't have to observe the Torah anymore. One of the ways they deal with it is with the concept of the witness people. Now, you have to understand that with the early Christians in the 1st century, 2nd century, even onto the 3rd century, when they came up with their theology of the second coming, in other words, Jesus clearly did not fulfill the messianic requirements and pretension. Even they don't deny that. But therefore, they come up with this idea that he needed, a second at bat to get it done. Okay, if he's the Mashiach, why does he need 2 at bats? Whatever. They say he needs 2 at-bats. But when they said that, they really thought that he was coming back imminently. In fact, those in the 1st century who said it thought he was coming any day. In the 2nd century, any day. Once we get to the 3rd century and for sure onto the 4th century, they had to kind of modify that a little bit. No, it's not imminent. It's at some point. We have to be ready for it, etc., etc., etc. Now, but as that time goes on, this Jewish problem becomes greater because we go into the 3rd, 4th, 5th century, and we have the Jewish people. Okay, yes, they had been at this point completely tormented, and we're going to see almost completely wiped out, which we said last week, and pretty much completely wiped out this week of the Jewish presence in Israel. But there's still a wonderful safe haven for the Jews in Babylon, and the Jews are thriving in Babylon, and they're writing down the Talmud, these volumes of Talmud. They're building major yeshivas. That is a huge theological problem for the Christians in the 4th and 5th century, and by the way, all the more so today in the 21st century. So how do they really deal with it? Here's what they say. They came up with a very creative philosophy or theology called the witness people, which means that why did the Jews who rejected Jesus survive? And when they originally said this, it had been 3 centuries, 4 centuries, but now it's been 21 centuries. How did they survive? How did they survive when the Romans are gone, the Byzantines are gone, the Crusaders are gone? And still somehow these Jews are here. How in the world did they survive? So they came up with the concept of what they called the witness people, meaning because they rejected Jesus, they weren't just going to die out. They had to be proven wrong. They being we, right? We had to be proven wrong. So we'll survive through eternity until Jesus comes back for his second coming to get the job done that he couldn't get the first time. And we'll all sit there and say, we were wrong. Look at that. And we'll all eat a big piece of humble pie and convert to Christianity. Now, by the way, it's interesting to point out that along with this concept of the witness people, won't go too deep into this concept, but it's a fascinating concept of something called the Pope's Jews, meaning the Pope from this time on until really modern times, I believe, always had a group of Jews that were protected and unmolested and allowed to live freely in Vatican City. And they're referred to as the Pope's Jews. So even when we're going to have the Crusaders and eventually the Nazis, who basically Pope Pius the 12th is turns a blind eye to Hitler in many ways, but when it came to their Pope's Jews, that they were always protected. So like Pius the 12th, when Mussolini allies himself with Hitler, and Hitler demands that Mussolini turn over all the Jews of Italy to the Nazis. Pius XII doesn't care about the Jews of Italy, but he does protest when they try to take his Jews, the Pope's Jews, because it's like saving an endangered species, and therefore they're protected within Vatican City through all of the attempted genocide from this point forward in history, so that they can be the witness people. So that's the theology that the church comes up with at this point to try to deal with us, the Jews. Okay, so as we said, the church splits into two. We have the Roman Catholic Church and we have the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, the word Catholic, what does that word mean? It means universal, because they were trying to say we're really the right ones, we're universal, we're for everybody, and therefore we're Catholic. It's interesting, another funny aside of Jewish history is that when Solomon Schechter in the 19th century and the early 20th century comes up with his different philosophies of how basically the Jewish people as a whole can make collective decisions to change the Torah or change the observance of the Torah, he refers to his theology as Catholic Israel. Now, that was kind of a PR blunder on his part, because while you already had a lot of more traditional Jewish groups look at him as what he was doing was very similar to what the Christians do, and then he goes and calls it Catholic Israel, wasn't good for PR. But anyways, back to the Christians. The Western Church calls themselves the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Church is the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, there's a lot of differences beyond geography from these churches. First of all, the language of each church. The Western Roman Catholic Church, their language is Latin, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, their language is Greek. In other words, the Roman Catholic Church at its core, their Bible is in Latin, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, their Bible is in Greek. Now, where in the world did the Catholic Church get their Latin Bible from? They did not go back to the Hebrew and translate it from the Hebrew into Latin. They went to, if you remember before, we spoke about the Septuagint, the Targum Shivim, the translation of the 72 rabbis of the Torah and Tanakh into Greek. That was the Greek Bible of the Eastern Orthodox Church. When the Roman Catholic Church, when the language of Rome is Latin, and this is already at the time of Constantine, the Greek Bible is translated into Latin. So it's now on its third level, if you will. It goes from Hebrew to Greek, Greek to Latin. And we're going to see, the concept of lost in translation. There's going to be theological differences between these two churches based on based on basically mistranslation. And the most famous example of this is the Theology of the Virgin Birth. That is based on a mistranslation because the word in the prophets that they are translating as Alma, which just means a young lady in Hebrew. In Greek, the Greek translation from Alma has a dual meaning of both being a young lady and a virgin. One or the other, it's interchangeable for both. When it goes into the Latin, it just gets translated as virgin, hence the theology of the virgin birth. Okay, so that's one big difference, the difference of languages, the fact that the Catholic Church is one more step removed from the source of the Hebrew Torah. That's one major difference. Another difference is the idea of celibacy, that the Roman Catholic Church is celibate. In other words, that's the church like the Pope, the cardinals, the monks, the nuns, where the holy people are celibate. In the Eastern Orthodox Church, they are not. Their leadership is not celibate. You know, I'm sure you all are familiar with that story of the Pope, how they recently found him in the Vatican and he was studying and he was looking into some books, and some of the cardinals walk in and they see the Pope as a distraught look on his face and he's just shaking his head, and they say, Pontiff, your Holiness, whatever they call him, what's wrong? And he goes, I'm just sitting here studying, and the word was celebrate, not celibate. Okay. Anyhow, so the Roman Catholic Church, they're the ones that are celibate. The Eastern Orthodox Church is not celibate. And the other major difference is that the Eastern Orthodox Church really has a strong pagan influence. There's not as much pagan influence in the Western Church, in the Roman Catholic Church. The Eastern Church has a lot of statues, has a lot of just a lot of these pagan concepts and cultures that are brought into their religion. So anytime you think of Christianity as a little bit more pagan, that's usually quite often the Eastern Orthodox Church with all of the different statues and really idols converted into whatever they call them. But that's the Eastern Orthodox Church. Beyond that, the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't really have a pope. That's a Roman Catholic thing. Rome, the city of Rome, Vatican, all that has no primacy in their church. So this is the first major theological split in Christianity. The Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, it's interesting to point out that now we're already up to the year, this real firm split happens in the 5th century, and Christianity started 400 years before. So you can imagine in 400 years of a lot of these theological points not being nailed down, that there's a lot of backwards and forwards and back and forth and different groups developing. Christianity today has hundreds of thousands of different groups, of different sects of Christianity, meaning the Roman Catholic Church will subdivide many times, the Eastern Orthodox Church will subdivide many times, and still later in the 18th century, 17th century, 18th century, we'll get up to the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant Church, and that'll split a million times, and you have so many different groups. Now, a lot of that comes from the problem that the development of the religion happens over a very long time, and a lot of these things aren't nailed down till centuries after the religion actually began. It's also interesting just to point out that in the Eastern Orthodox Church, that area is going to fall, most of that area, a lot of that area is going to fall in the Muslim conquest to the Muslims, and in Islam, statues are really a problem, and therefore a lot of these famous statues that belong to the Eastern Orthodox Church are going to end up being destroyed by the Muslims. Okay. Now, what's going on with the Jews? Okay, that's what's going on with the Christians. We'll see a lot of interplay between us and them, but what's going on with us? We're pretty much at this point safely in Babylon. Babylon is not under control of the Romans, nor is it under the control of the church. The power of the Eastern Orthodox Church really stops at the Arabian Peninsula, stops at modern day Iraq. They just never had influence there. So therefore, the local religions are still pagan religions, and the Jews have the autonomy to continue to thrive. And it is at this time that the Jews complete the Babylonian Talmud. If you recall from last week, the Jerusalem Talmud got interrupted in the process, but the Babylonian Talmud basically sees itself to its completion. It's completed around the year 475. The final redactors are two rabbis by the name of Ravina, the second Ravina that we have mentioned in the Talmud, and Rav Ashi. And they are the ones who we credit with redacting the Talmud, finishing the early editions of the Talmud. So by the year 475, we essentially have the Talmud as we know it today. I mean that content-wise as we have it today. We'll see the organization of it still goes through a little bit of development. Now, as we've mentioned before, throughout Jewish history, we have our different categories of rabbis. We mentioned how the Tanaim are the rabbis of the Mishnah. So the rabbis from basically the beginning of the Second Commonwealth up until when the Jews basically will leave Israel in the year 200 or so. That's the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishnah. The rabbis of the Talmud, of the Gemara, are known as the Amarayam, and that's basically from the year 200 to the year 475, 500, what we're talking about now. And that's all the rabbis mentioned in the Gemara, mentioned in the expanded section of the Talmud, the section of the Talmud that expands on the Mishnah. The next group of rabbis we have is the Rabbanim Savarayim. So just if we follow the names, Tanaim, teachers, Amarayam, speakers, Savarayim, thinkers. Okay, so we'll have to look for different educational terms. Now, again, it's not like at some point there was a rabbi stood up and said, okay, the time period of the Tanaim has ended, now we are all Amarayim. And then after that, someone stood up and said, okay, the time period of the Amarayim has ended, we are now the Savarayim. No, these are names put on by latter scholars. But be it as it may, the next group of rabbis that doesn't really function for so long is the group that really takes the Talmud as it was sealed by Ravina and Rav Ashi and do a lot of the work to make it a usable set, usable volumes. And what they do is they first of all, they do a lot of the editing. They do a lot of editing work. They put in a lot of the punctuation. The Talmud in and of itself has very little punctuation, but whatever it has was added into it by the Rabbanim Savarayim. They also break it up into chapters. The chapters as we know it, the tractates as we know it were there already, but the chapters were added in by the Savarayim. The pages, well, they were on scrolls still at this point, but the different breakups were all from the Savarayim. Now, the other major thing they did was they made a lot of copies. Now, at this point, it's still papyrus and quills, but we know that we have some of those even left in different Jewish museums around the world. And basically, what they would have is they would have different experts amongst the Savarayim. That it'd be the different tractates, different chapters would be their job to just sit there and write it all day. And we know that because we can compare handwritings of every. For example, Tractate Shabbos we found has a very similar handwriting, but it's different than the handwriting, let's say, Tractate Megillah. But that's a big thing they did because we're still, 1,000 years before the printing press. So the way that this book is going to have mass use in the Jewish people is it has to be sent throughout the Jewish people. So the Rabbanim Savarayim take it under their task to be sure to send the Talmud throughout the whole Jewish people, to write the scrolls, make sure the scrolls are available for the different yeshivas that had been opening up and were thriving, and the parts of the Jewish world where they would need the copies of the Talmud. Okay, so that brings us to about up to the year 550, and really at that point, the Talmud of the year 550 is basically the Talmud we have today. Now, the Talmud we have today is what we call the Vilna edition, or the Vilna Shas. But when we talk about it, that is, it's not just the Talmud, but it's the different commentaries and the layout and all that. That'll come about in the 17th century in Vilna, putting it together in book form, exactly in layout form as we have it today. But the words of the actual Talmud and the tractates and the chapters and whatever punctuation is there, that is already there in the year 550, and all archaeological finds of the scrolls, and the scrolls have been preserved, back up the Talmud of today is the Talmud of 1,500 years ago. Okay, now, at this point, we mentioned last week how after Constantine and Israel was done for the Jews, the final destruction, so to speak, comes at the hands of one of the Roman emperors by the name of Justinian, that he basically, there's an interesting circumstance that takes place, and that is that some of these other smaller empires that are seeing that Rome is starting to crumble want to take advantage of that. And we see that the Persians want to try and take over parts of the Roman Empire, and they make a deal with the Jews. They make a deal with the Jews that if, we can take over the Byzantine Empire, if we can take over Israel, we'll let you rebuild your temple, and you can be Jewish once again in Israel. The Jews made that deal, and they sided with the Persians. Eventually, Justinian gets the upper hand. He wins the war and takes this opportunity to completely end the Jewish presence in Israel, completely making it Judenrein. And at this point, in roughly 535, it is the absolute end of the Jews in Israel. Okay, I wanted to mention one more thing about the Talmud before we go on, and that is that the Talmud is given to us, it's written, the Babylonian Talmud is written in the language of Aramaic. Now, Aramaic was basically the lingua franca, the main language of the Babylonian Empire. It started with the Aramites, but it was the main language. And therefore, if it was the main language of the Babylonians, it was basically the main language of the Jews as well. So that is what we speak while we are in Babylon. And because of that, that's the language that the Talmud is written in. Now, it's not the exact Talmud the exact Aramaic that the non-Jews would speak. It was probably more analogous to Yiddish and German. Like Yiddish is basically German with a lot of Jewish thrown in, right? A lot of Jewish words and Jewish dialect and whatnot, but at its core and the structure, many of the words are still German. Jewish Aramaic was probably the same thing. It was the language of Aram, the language they were speaking in Babylon, but a lot of Jewish thrown into it. And the Talmud, as we have it, is written in the what we call the Eastern dialect of Aramaic. In Israel, they spoke the Western dialect of Aramaic, and that's why it's a different Aramaic in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. But be it as it may, the language of the Talmud is the language of Aramaic, or the Jewish version of Aramaic. Okay, so that's what's going on in the world. That's the Talmud, the end of Israel. Jews in Babylon are thriving. Now we have the other third major monotheistic religion start its rise in the world, which we'll delve into a lot of the details of next week, but I would like to at least start with an introduction right now. So it's interesting, when we look at the development of Christianity, as we just mentioned, that a lot of the issues with all the different groups and machlokesim and debates within Christianity come out of the fact that the religion was really developing over the course of 400 years. What's fascinating is that Islam will develop as a religion in about, 20 or 30 years, because we're going to see that Muhammad will come on the scene as a self-proclaimed prophet in the year 610, and he'll be gone from the planet by the year 632. So in about 20 years, we're going to see the whole religion come about, and then the conquest that will come after, by the end of the 7th century, will be complete. So if we look at Islam as starting roughly in 620, we're going to see that by the year 700, it's already not only a well-formed religion, but it has conquered half of the world. Much quicker rise, right? 50 to 80 years as opposed to 400 years. And that's why we see within Islam there's a lot less. There is still sectarianism. There are different groups, but a lot less than Christians, a little bit more than the Jews. But that's because, again, it was formed much quicker, tighter together, and not over the course of a lot of time, a lot of different places, etc. The environment that Islam starts in is in the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula never becomes Roman. Maybe the tip of it does, but for sure the parts that we're talking about, more the mid part, the southern part, never becomes Roman. For sure, the church has no touch there. It is a paganistic place through and through. Always has been, always will be. Right? That is what it is. But the pagan places in the world were also starting to feel that bankruptness of paganism that we mentioned too as a precursor to Christianity. And one such person who starts to feel that lack of meaning, if you will, in paganism is a man by the name of Muhammad. Born in the year 570, as we said, dies in the year 632. He was basically an orphan his whole entire life, or most of his life. His father died before he was born. His mother died when he was 6. He was raised by Bedouins. He became a caravan leader, which was a pretty lucrative business in that day. And the tribe, the pagan tribe that he comes from, is known as the Hashemite Tribe, and that's why today, if you know that, like the Jordan, the monarchy of Jordan, they call themselves the Hashemites. Hashemites always claiming descendancy from Muhammad, but he was basically a pagan caravan driver going all over all over the world, and in a lot of his different trips around the world, he interacted with a lot of monotheists, both Jews and Christians. And therefore, it was through that interacting with the monotheists, he starts to feel the lack of meaning in paganism, and it will ultimately spark and spawn him to start his own religion, to create the Muslim religion, and that is what we will talk about, God willing, next week, as we will delve into the rise of Islam, and really with it, just about the end of paganism in the world, because the Muslims will initially be successful in all the areas of the world that are still pagan, the Arabian Peninsula, the former Babylonian Empire, North Africa, all the places where the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church are not. And then they'll even chisel away large parts of the Christian world as well, and essentially taking over half the world, close to half the world. And that is what we'll discuss more into depth next week. I look forward to having you with us. I thank you for coming, and I thank you for listening.